Okay, this one is going to be more about just some more stuff about martials and design and general stuff. But I guess it's less about the disparity between martials and spellcasters, and it's more about weapons. So I've talked about weapons before, and the main different weapon setups you can have in 5e at the current moment. But particularly thinking about both two-weapon fighting itself, both in the real world, and the way the mechanics technically break down in 5e. First, if your character has two different weapons, one in each hand, if you want to engage in two-weapon fighting, they both have to be light, correct? And, you have to be proficient, I guess, but they have to be light weapons. Now, technically, you could have two non-light weapons in your hands, like a long sword and two long swords. Nothing is preventing you from making attacks with them. You just can't get that, rules as written bonus action offhand attack, which is either a second attack in Tier 1 or a third attack in Tier 2. Technically, what you can do is have a character that has two different weapons, and you're just holding both of them. And if you don't have extra attack, okay, you can decide which of your two weapons you want to make your weapon attack with. And you just make it as normal. You just have two weapons, which are two different options. Otherwise, or if you're in Tier 2, you could make an attack with either one, or an attack with just your left-hand weapon, or two attacks with your right-hand weapon. It gives you options, make an attack with either weapon. Now, there's other reasons for why that is pointless, because there's not a whole lot of variety in weapon types. You don't get any actual benefit from using a longsword in one hand and a morning star in the other. There's no mechanical benefit unless, say, you have both the slasher and the crusher feat, which I don't know why you're going to have both of those feats. That's an immense feat tax at that point. I don't know why you would have that, but theoretically you could. Or the way that is much more common and makes a lot more sense is if you have two different magic weapons that have dramatic effects. Like, say, the first time this weapon attack hits on a turn, it does a thing, the Sword of Thorns. The first time you hit a target on your turn, it has to make a saving throw or get restrained. And then the mace, the Morning Star of explosions, the first time you hit a target on your turn, it explodes and they take extra damage. Something, if both of those weapons are, once per turn type deals, then yeah, you could use both of them and use one of your two attacks on each weapon and get the benefits of it. That would be, a way to do this. You have the dual-wielding flavor, but you've got two really powerful once-per-turn weapons and a reason to use them in this way. That said, there's not a lot of magic items that I think function this way. Or at the very least, if they do, they also have charges associated with them, and you don't necessarily want to use them all right away on one turn, but it is an option. But going back to the two-weapon fighting style and the weapon setup, it's mostly written as, they have to be light so that you can get this bonus additional attack. That's the main benefit. And also, one of the other factors is not considering feats. Two-weapon fighting is the highest damage style you can go for in Tier 1 and Tier 2, depending on character. For basically everybody that isn't a fighter, this is the better option, more or less. Especially if you don't have a bonus action. If you do have a bonus action, then it gets tricky. But, the math roughly breaks down that all other things equal, 2-weapon fighting will do like 1 or 2 more average damage per turn, per attack. Or not per attack, but per turn. Because you make 50% more attacks. Once you get to tier 3, it actually becomes better for paladins because they have that extra improved divine smite and they don't have a whole lot to do with their bonus action. So they get extra mileage out of 2-weapon fighting. And fighters get an extra or a third attack, so they actually get less value out of this. It's still technically better, again, by another like point or so, I think. I didn't do the math for that one, but I think it's still like, it's either even or it's just slightly better. It's fine. But if you add feats into it, namely, oh wait, actually I think it loses to, no, it doesn't lose to dueling. You know, a one-handed weapon with dueling, because that just puts dueling on par with the big, heavy two-handed weapons, so it's fine. But, what do you call it? If you factor in feats, 2-weapon fighting loses out massively, because instead of a roughly 2-point difference, you've got more like a 12-point difference, factoring, of course you have to factor in the lower to hit chance with Great Weapon Master, and you know, depending on the target's AC, you may or may not want to do this, but generally, Great Weapon Fighting, or Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter now blow 2-weapon fighting out of the water. And especially there's other ways to get these benefits as well, with like Polearm Master or Crossbow Expert. And there's one other big detriment of 2-weapon fighting, is that, one, it takes your bonus action, which Polearm Master and Crossbow Expert do, but it takes your bonus action and it dominates both of your hands. You have to have 2 weapons. You have to buy twice as many weapons, find twice as many weapons, like loot twice as many weapons to be able to be competitive. Whereas Crossbow Expert, you just need a single hand crossbow. Polearm Master, you just need a single polearm, and you can have you can use that with a shield or a spear and a shield, and still have that extra defense. Like, you know, there's lots of options there. And the dual wielder feat helps out, but not enough. If you really wanted to make this more competitive, the dual wielder feat would let your offhand attack benefit from extra attack. That's the simplest way to do it, to bring it in line with those feats. Of course, you're making more attacks now, and that has its own detriments. But there's a few ways you could do it. Add extra damage per strike. Add an additional strike with your offhand. There's a few ways, and I've talked about them before. But specifically, I'm kind of talking about this because, this idea of, using multiple weapons, but you're not actually using 2-weapon fighting. This works out for a character I'm playing, Raskris. He has, right now, a pair of swords, a longsword and a scimitar, by the rules, that have this benefit where they can absorb elemental energy, and the first attack they make after absorbing it, they do bonus elemental damage. Now, you can just treat this as, the first attack you make just does extra damage. And then, you just do the attack, and then you just use the longsword normally. Or, if I really want to load into that, I make the first attack with the longsword, and then I make my second attack with the wakizashi. Or, I call it wakizashi scimitar, because it's a katana and a wakizashi in universe, but... So I can make 2 attacks on the same turn, and one using one sword, one using the other, and get that bonus elemental damage. Then I would put the wakizashi away and just fight with the longsword. Or also there's this homebrew Iaido feat that we have, where I can attack with a sheathed weapon as a bonus action or a reaction, and I have 2 weapons that are sheathed in this way. So I'll always have the option of either using the sword offensively, using the longsword offensively as a bonus action on my turn, and then there's also a reaction attack that I can use in the same way, only when it's sheathed though, and someone approaches the character. So same kind of idea. Like on that first turn, bonus action attack with the katana to draw it, and then 2 normal attacks with it. And then, let's say that first target is dead. Raskris, my character, moves up, and then another enemy approaches him on their turn. Ooh, reaction attack with the wakizashi. But now he's got 2 weapons in his hand, and the next turn, he has to spend a bonus action to put one of them away. He can still hold them just fine, as long as he doesn't engage in 2-weapon fighting. He's fine holding a non-light weapon in one of his hands. But that would also prevent him from 2-handing the katana or drawing the scabbard, which is mechanically a shield. Those have those issues. So, there's ways to get that kind of dual wielding flavor without using 2-weapon fighting. But of course, 2-weapon fighting in the real world does have its problems. One, actually, moving back a little bit, one of the main fantasies for 2-weapon fighting is an absolute flurry of attacks. Everybody that's playing a 2-weapon fighter in any game wants to be able to make twice as many attacks. And a lot of games do that very well. Monster Hunter have dual blades, a weapon set that is just that. They're the fastest weapons in the game. I can't think of any other games, but, lots of games do this relatively well. Some games do it poorly. Like Elder Scrolls, like Skyrim, does it, really terribly. You can make attacks with each weapon separately, or you can hit both buttons to attack with them both. And that's fine, but you just effectively just have a heavy attack, basically, and you get the flavor. But Skyrim isn't a hard game, so who cares? But in the real world, that's not the case. The main benefits of using 2 weapons is a more defensive, parry-oriented kind of style. Unless you can attack with both weapons at once, but you don't get this flurry of attacks. Instead, what you get is 2 attacks at the same time aimed at different points on your opponent's body that then, unless they have a shield, becomes very difficult to effectively defend against. That's the benefit of having 2 weapons from an offensive state. The problem there is when you're throwing a cut from both of your weapons in this way, you probably aren't as well defended. There's not a whole lot of, authentic styles being developed or that have been developed using 2 weapons outside of rapier and parrying dagger. But that's leans into the other main benefit of having 2 different weapons versus when you have a shield and a weapon. Somebody's throwing cuts at you. You can obviously block with your shield and very easily defend against a lot of them, and they have to try to get around your shield, potentially opening them up to your own counter strikes. But if you're using 2 weapons, it's a little easier for your opponent to attack you because there isn't this giant area of just flat denial armor that they can't get through. And instead, there's 2 weapons. Now, what can happen is, they throw a cut, you parry it, and you have a whole other weapon ready to perform a counter-strike right away. Now, if you're parrying with a shield, if you're parrying with either a shield or just a weapon you have, there's no reason you can't counter-strike right away, depending on how the position of the parry and how strong you are and other things. But if you parry in a certain way, you can just throw a cut. Like if you parry and then just do a little nick kind of cut. Because not every cut you throw has to be incredibly potent. Sometimes just like a quick little glancing blow can do enough damage to cause a little bit, draw some blood, get them to start bleeding, maybe consider giving up, running away, or exhaust them, or just cause enough pain that they can't concentrate as hard, and then you can win the next interaction. There's a lot of that. But with two weapons, you can do that much more cleanly. In fact, you can parry with one and then attack with both. Like, there are benefits, but it's a much harder style to probably use because manipulating two weapons is difficult, especially if they're larger weapons. And if they're the same size, you can have issues binding your weapons up against each other if you're not practiced enough. So it would take a bit more training than, another simpler system to use. And also, using two hands on a single larger weapon might be the better idea because you can parry more effectively at more difficult angles. Like if you're holding a sword like this and you block a blow over here, if you only have one hand on the weapon, you don't have a lot of leverage to stop them from blowing through your guard. Whereas if you have two hands on the weapon, you've got more leverage, more manipulation points, and it's a lot easier to defend. And defend and throw a cut right back. There's a lot of little nuances and stuff in that, and mostly two-weapon fighting isn't really a thing in the real world. That's just kind of how it is. But it's also one of those things that can theoretically work. It's just a little more difficult. But in the on a battlefield, in like a war situation, you're generally using a spear anyway. You need range. A sword, even a long sword, or an arming sword, or any kind of sword, is a sidearm in a battlefield situation, or in a duel situation. Generally, you're using the same or at least similar weapon setup to your opponent, whether that's like a rapier or a single arming sword. Like, you're using different weapon setups have different benefits. Like, I don't know if I talked about it in these videos before, but I saw a really good kind of educational little comic talking about like 3 different like fantasy characters and what their gear speaks to and what they have to deal with. Like, first one was a soldier, like, standardized armor, a spear, a shield, and talking about how the strength of a soldier comes from their relatively basic training and the group, like, forming a phalanx. Like, they have a soldier to their right, a soldier to their left that also has a shield and a spear. They can rely on each other to strengthen their relatively weak skill, like low weapon skill, we'll call it that, or their simplistic setup. But that's extremely effective. Then a duelist has like no armor, a larger rapier with lots of range, limited cutting ability, and is mainly just for thrusting, but they're mainly fighting other duelists. That setup would not be good on like a battlefield. And then the last character was an adventurer, which more or less purely exists in fantasy concepts. You'd have travelers in the real world, but I mean, adventurers weren't a thing, maybe wandering mercenaries, but then they would be using a more similar setup to like a soldier. They might have a shield and a spear for general combat, and in this case, this adventurer had a great sword. They had a great sword, a few hand axes, a smaller sword, like they had a bunch of different weapons, because they have to deal with a lot of different scenarios. Like, they have to deal with like giant bears, werebats, like all sorts of nonsense. And a weapon that is useful against one enemy might not be useful against another. And this isn't true in 5e, but in a generalized fantasy setting, yeah, it would be. yeah, I'm not sure exactly what this video was about. Just lots of different weapon setups. But yeah, I guess that's it. Do I have any other points to make? I have some thoughts about like some other like class related stuff, but it doesn't fit in this video, so I'm not going to put it in this video.